Well, it's certainly an attrition conflict. Russia has moved from what they would hope would be a blitzkrieg, a very quick assault on Ukraine, and they failed in this. So now they turn to shelling cities, killing civilians. The best example and the worst, the most tragic one is, of course, Mariupol. But it's not a frozen conflict by any means. It's a stalemate, but in which Ukrainians keep dying. That's why the Western support is still very necessary, but in which, of course, Russia is not reaching its strategic objectives.
So we're hearing these warnings at the moment that Russia is preparing to use chemical weaponry. In your opinion, would that tip us into a full-fledged conflict between NATO and Russia if that were to happen?
Well, it's an excellent question, and I'm sure that this is something that leaders of NATO that will be meeting this week in Brussels, and then President Biden will be traveling to Warsaw will discuss. Putin is unfortunately desperate, and he's not winning. He's cornered. And that's why we are all worried about the use of chemical weapons, which would be a terrible escalation. This is also something that we are seeing in Russia media. Frankly, I don't know how Western democracies will react to it. We have shown again and again that it's a bit of an unpredictable business on our side. And I see much more of a change on the West than I expected. But clearly the West will have to come up with a much better response and much greater support for Ukraine if this unfortunate use of chemical weapons was to happen.
It's stunning that we're having this conversation, isn't it? If we think back to Syria and the use of chemical weapons was seen as a red line, and right in Europe now we're discussing that potential. What type of deterrence could we see happen or see used from the West? What would be useful here? We've already been discussing potential oil embargoes from the European side, but it doesn't feel as though that even would be enough.
Right. There are really three elements that will have to happen if this war escalates, but even if it just continues, and we'll have to dial up and down those. One is the military support for Ukraine. The West has done a lot. President Biden last week signed another bill shifting 800 million of military help to Ukraine. We are passing on more advanced anti-aircraft and anti-missile weapons. That has to continue and probably increase, so it's the Ukrainians who can close the sky over their heads. Sanctions will certainly have to continue to be part of the pressure on Russia. Now, of course, if the war escalates further with the use of chemical weapons, the sanctions will have to be really will have to come to the end of sort of this pressure. And the third element is, and this is why Biden is traveling to Poland, is support the eastern flank of the alliance to make sure with military, with different posture, to make sure that this war does not spill into NATO territory.
I want to discuss that a little bit further with you, because a Pentagon spokesperson yesterday said that this is the 9/11 moment for Europe, the wake-up call that we are seeing about the threat from Russia. Do you think it is? Do you think that Europe really perceives that there is a threat from Russia at this point, that the end game, as the Ukrainians have been warning, is not just Ukraine, it is far beyond that in terms of what Russia's also been saying publicly?
Well, President Putin spelled out very clearly what his ambition is before he started this war. Point number one was Ukraine. Point number two was basically a gray zone in Central and Eastern Europe. And point number three was making sure that America is no longer a European power. So he's grind to a stalemate on ambition number one. Point number one, but that does not mean that he forgot of the other two. And that's why we do have to prepare. We finally have to take him seriously. And if you ask if Europe is changing its mind, I think we are. again, with different speeds. In my region, I'm speaking to you from Warsaw. This is not news. This is unfortunately just a confirmation of something that we have seen develop already with the war in Georgia in 2008 and then attack on Ukraine in 2014. But I think the rest of the Europe is turning around as well. And Americans are pointing this to this awakening because it is clear from their perspective that it will not be only the US who will have to provide the new level of security, this new, very, very strong forward posture of NATO in Central and Eastern Europe. It will have to be both the Americans and the Europeans who stand up to Putin's Russia, also in NATO's territory.
And yet, Michael, I've been doing a lot of reading, a lot of history, trying to work out about the Russian psyche, whether it comes from some form of nationalism, pan-Slavism, whatever it may well be. But there was a great quote from Catherine the Great that the only way to defend Russia's borders is to expand Russia's borders. You're talking about a more forward enhanced NATO, Russia looking to expand its borders. Are we genuinely looking at the foothills of World War III?
I think we are looking at, first of all, hopefully not. Secondly, we might be looking at the end of Russia as we have known it because Putin really overextended himself. But if he survives this, I think what we might be looking at is foothills of new Cold War, where Baltic states, Poland, Romania become the new West Germany, where we have the forward posture of NATO that we have seen in Western Germany during Cold War, proportionally adjusted. So, your question points to an objective number one, which is making sure that this war does not escalate and that this war does come to an end, that Russia pulls out from Ukraine, and that we find some kind of, that Ukrainians and Russians with the Western help find some kind of political settlement that allows for this conflict to come to, this very bloody conflict to come to an end.